At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
On the 80th anniversary of D-Day, close to the beaches of Normandy, they gathered once again, and for some, for the very last time. Presidents, prime ministers, even a king came to pay their respects, to remember, and to pledge never to forget.
Our obligation to remember them, what they stood for, and what they achieved for us all, can never diminish.
That small number of veterans still able to make the journey were greeted as heroes. They themselves would argue the true heroes were the ones whose names are on the gravestones, the ones who did not make it back. Those world leaders gathering to mark D-Day and the liberation of Europe that followed must surely have cast eyes across those cemeteries and been reminded that war has not disappeared from the continent. That once again, to look east, is to see a manifesting threat. I'm Niall Paterson, and in this edition of The Daily, we will reflect on the events in Normandy today and 80 years ago, and ask what we can learn from the Second World War that might help us avoid a third. In a moment, our military analyst Michael Clarke on the events of 1944 and their very direct relevance to today.
The best way to deal with escalation is to have the preparation and the forces that can prevent it. If you just keep turning away from it, then a dictator like Putin will work on that. You know, I mean, Putin, he's not much of a strategist. He's not a chess player, but he is a poker player. He's a really good poker player. He's a risk taker.
But we begin in Normandy itself with Sky's Rhiannon Mills. Rhiannon, good to have you back on the podcast. Just give us a little bit of a taste of what you have been seeing there today, the 80th anniversary commemorations of the events around D-Day.
It's felt incredibly special to be here. I've never travelled to Normandy for D-Day commemorations, so I didn't really know what to expect. People had told me that crowds travel from all over the world, and I think because this is the 80th anniversary, everyone has made extra efforts to go out of their way to make this a really special commemorative couple of days. And we got up early, like many other people, and made our way to Aramonche Beach and saw the sunrise this morning. And there was just this silence. And when you looked out at that huge expanse of beach and just soaked up the peace of it all, it's just so difficult to comprehend the horrors really that face those brave men who made their way onto the beach from 6 o'clock in the morning. Gold Beach, where we are, 25,000 troops landed throughout that day. 400 of them lost their lives in just 24 hours. Over 1,000 of them were injured. But
of course, on occasions such as this, it is an opportunity for heads of state, heads of government, even kings, to stand in front of the assembled current members of the armed forces, but also those veterans that have gathered. We've been hearing from Charles today.
Look, you have to remember that the King is still undergoing cancer treatment. But last week it was made very clear to me that he was determined to be involved in as much of the D-Day commemorations as he possibly could. Him and the Queen led those tributes at the British Normandy Memorial. And I think what we've kept hearing right throughout the various speeches that the King has made over the last couple of days is that we need to listen to those veterans. We need to strive to live up to what they have shown us. But also, he's been making that point that we aren't passive observers in this. He makes it very clear that, sadly, many of those veterans won't be with us for much longer. And so it's up to us now to continue their memories. Of course, Prince William has also been over here as well, and he will join the other international dignitaries, his father wanting, I think, really to focus on the veterans. So it's Prince William who's going to be doing the meeting and greeting the likes of Biden, Trudeau, Macron, President Zelensky.
Why don't we push the politicians to one side, though, for a second, Rhiannon, and focus on those who are the most important, the veterans, some of whom you've actually been honoured enough to be able to speak to?
One of the most moving things that I think I've seen over the last couple of days is veterans who are in their 90s hearing the national anthem and wanting to get to their feet to make sure that, as they would have done when they served 80 years ago, they can mark that national anthem in the way that they want to. And they stand there bolt upright as much as they can. And it is such an effort for them. And so to spend some time with them has been a remarkable privilege, especially when they themselves know that they are unlikely to ever be able to make this journey ever again.
Lest we forget. Rhiannon, many thanks indeed. So let's look back on the events of the 6th of June 1944 with our military analyst, Professor Michael Clarke. Michael, always good to see you. On a day such as this, when we are remembering, commemorating, reflecting on what happened 80 years ago today, what are your thoughts? We often hear that this was the most ambitious military operation, certainly of its time and perhaps of all time, but it really was a pivotal moment in the Second World War.
Neil, it's a day of reflection on very personal things as well as very big things. I mean, I think about my own father. He went in on Sword Beach with the South Flanks, and I'm struck looking at the commemorations at the youth of everybody involved. And there's a couple of lines from that A.E. Houseman poem that always clatter in my head at times like this. We said, life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it, and we were young. And when you look at the personal stories of people involved in what was happening 80 years ago today, then the youth of everybody, 17-year-old, 18, 19, 22-year-old, that always strikes one. And the big side was that it was one huge, huge calculation, because this operation was either going to be a fundamental success, although possibly at great cost, or a catastrophic failure. And the equation was a really simple one in big terms. And they had to get 155,000 troops on the beaches and off the beaches to a beachhead in 24 hours. And if they were still there at the end of the second day, if they were still fighting and alive, then the invasion would succeed. That was it. Are they still alive after 36, 48 hours? Are they still functioning? Because all the stuff that was coming behind them, 2 million men in Britain waiting to cross to fight the battle to liberate Europe, those 2 million men had to have a beachhead. So if the beachhead was held for 24 hours after the invasion, then it would succeed. So the calculation for the June the 6th itself was 155,000 men onto the beachheads inside a day. Could they do it? Well, yes, they did.
But of course, at considerable cost.
I mean, it was the worst on Omaha Beach. The two American beaches were Utah and Omaha. It was worst on Omaha for a whole series of reasons. I mean, lots of technical issues that intervened, and it meant that the second wave group didn't come in. The group that was due to come in by about 7:15 was late arriving, not their fault. The tanks didn't get in time. And so the men on the beach, the first and second waves, got completely pinned down. And they had to work their way up through some gaps in the bluffs. And there weren't that many Germans on the bluffs, but it didn't need many with machine guns just to mow them down on the beaches. And so it was a pretty horrendous process. I mean, it took them until about 2 or 3 in the afternoon to get off Omaha Beach. On the British beaches and the Canadian beaches, on Juno and Gold and Sword, they were off the beaches by about 9 or 10 and were establishing their beachheads inland. And by noon, they'd linked up with the airborne. And of course, the beaches where my father went in on Sword, the beaches were still being bombed and mortared and some air attacks. So they're still very dangerous places. But they'd pushed inland a little bit, half a mile to a mile. So at least they weren't so pinned down on the beaches as they were at Omaha for several hours. And famously, of course, the commander on Omaha Beach, as he was trying to rally his men to get them up inside the bluffs, to actually get them through these gaps in the bluffs, he was saying, there's only 2 sorts of men on this beach, son. Those who are dead and those who are going to die. Get off the beach. They had to get off the beach. Absolutely critical.
Did your father ever talk about his own experiences on swords?
He did talk about it, but he only ever talked about the jokey side of it. He was full of all the humour of military life, all the absurdities, the things that the sergeants said that just had everybody laughing. And I know just from my own, slight acquaintance with military operations, people are hilarious when they're crouched under a table under a mortar attack or whatever it might be. They say stupid things and everybody starts laughing. It's partly a reaction, of course, to fear. I know that he kept to himself. I know he did. And later in life, he tried to tell me about them and he couldn't really try to understand, but he could only really share it with his mates because they shared not just a comradeship of battle, they also shared a sense of guilt, sort of shared guilt. They know what they did during the war. They know the brutality of it. They were guilty together and they didn't really want to talk about that sort of existential guilt which comes with being a soldier on operations that I think they all have.
Which I think makes those that are now talking about their experiences on that day and indeed in the days and weeks and months that followed, it makes it all the more important that we listen to them and we never forget.
And along with bravery and stoicism goes cowardice and fear. It's often been said somebody who does a brave thing on one day wouldn't necessarily have done it the previous day or the day after, or somebody just behind them would have done the same thing 2 minutes later. But there's a sort of randomness to bravery, as there is a randomness to human cowardice, to human fear, to human reactions. The biggest driving force for all soldiers going forward on a beach, going forward to attack, the biggest driving force is not patriotism or the cause or the sense of mission. The real driving force is because your mates are going, because you go as a group. And when you're not in a group, when the group is split up, when you're on your own, then you're beset by all the natural human emotions. But when you're in a group, you go forward because the group goes forward.
Let's just reflect on what happened next. This was at the beginning of the end when it came to the liberation of Europe. How did the Allies move forward and ultimately achieve that goal then?
The Battle of Normandy afterwards was not as well planned. And the Germans were slow to respond to begin with because they still thought, even after D-Day had taken place, Hitler was convinced that the real attack was coming in Calais. And what actually happened is that the British had the effect, although they were pinned down, they couldn't take Caen for weeks, which was their first objective. Although they were pinned down, they actually had the effect of shielding the Americans who were further westward. When the breakout did come in the Falaise Gap after 6 weeks or so, it was absolutely brutal. Absolutely brutal. And the Germans just collapsed. And the reason the Germans just collapsed is because Hitler demanded that every inch of territory be fought for. He would not allow a sort of a defense that pulled back and pulled back. The counterattacks were fierce and every inch was to be defended. And so when the Germans did crack, as inevitably they had to, there was nothing behind them. And the Allies then found, once they broke out of the beachheads, which was actually in July, they were in Brussels in days, and that sense that, Europe's going to be liberated. And there they were in the autumn, moving really, really quickly. But of course, they then still had to cross the Rhine. They had to get into Germany. And that process was to take much longer than anyone imagined. And so from the 6th of June, 1944, to the 8th of May, 1945, which is VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, that was far more months than anybody anticipated. They thought the war might be over in 2 or 3 months now.
One of the things that perhaps the cinematic representations of this time either get wrong or do not dwell on enough is the international nature of what happened back in June 44, the coalition of nations that came together.
Yeah, because at the time, there were two other big fronts in the war. One was Italy, where the Allied troops, British and American troops, are slogging up Italy. And of course, Rome fell exactly during this week, but of course they weren't to get the whole of Italy until May 1945. And the other great front, the huge front, of course, was the Eastern Front, where the Germans, having come back from Stalingrad and the Battle of Moscow, were slowly moving in across Poland on Germany. Again, they weren't to get into Germany for some time, but the Germans after D-Day were fighting a big war on 3 major fronts, I mean, the Italian front, the Eastern Front, and now the Western Front. But by June 1944, the Allies were a pretty big group of nations, and Germany had really not much chance of surviving. And the only question was, how hard were they going to fight, hoping that they'd do some sort of peace deal. What the Germans always wanted was that we'll do a peace deal with the West, with the Americans and the British, and we'll jointly turn against the Bolsheviks. We'll jointly turn on the Russians. But the whole point about Second World War thinking, this goes back to the wartime conferences of 1943, 1944, they said unconditional surrender. We're not going to do any peace deal. We're not going to have any issue like in the First World War, where Germany claimed there was a false peace. They claimed they were stabbed in the back. None of that. You'll unconditionally surrender. No deals until you lay down your arms and we walk right into Berlin, and then we will talk about the future.
Thank you, Michael. When we return, more on D-Day and what the events of 80 years ago can tell us about the world of today. Back soon.
Isolationism was not the answer 80 years ago and is not the answer today. We know the dark forces that these heroes fought against 80 years ago. They never fade. Aggression and greed, the desire to dominate and control, to change borders by force, these are perennial.
US President Joe Biden there addressing those gathered in Normandy, and he raises a point of significance. To look forward, we must first look back. The lessons of history are there for all of us to see. Our military analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, is still with me. We bring things up to date into 2024, into the 21st century, Michael, and we are not in a place where there is all-out conflict, but there are a number of those very alarming signs that existed in the 1930s and indeed into the 40s, aren't there?
Yeah, there are two big issues which emphasize the similarities. One is that the Ukraine war is the return of industrial age warfare to Europe. And so we're talking about the Russians have got a war economy, they've geared up for war, and the West is struggling to gear up for war without inconveniencing ourselves too much. And so there's that mismatch at the moment in the terms of the commitment. The second thing, which is interesting and is a similarity with D-Day in a way, is that both Ukraine and Russia are now fighting with their second echelon forces. You know, on D-Day, the forces that went in on the beaches they were solicitors and clerks and train drivers. They were civilians who had joined the army or been conscripted to fight this war. The professional army had been destroyed in effect. And so a second echelon army was created. Now, that's exactly what has happened in Ukraine. Over 3 years of war, both sides have lost the armies that they started with. Not man for man, but they've lost the equivalent numbers, and those armies have now been, in a sense, dismantled in favor of new armies that have been raised. So the Russians have lost 500,000 people. They started with 200,000 invading Ukraine, so they've lost more than twice the number that they started with. And the vast majority of the Russians now fighting have been brought in for this war. And the same with Ukraine, not quite to the same extent, but nevertheless, it's the same phenomenon. And then, Neil, the thing that is so different is that whereas 1944 and the Second World War, it was clear to the whole world that this battle really mattered. Yeah. This was a battle between fascism, autocracy, wicked dictatorship, and freedom, whatever that meant. Nobody had any doubt what was at stake in this war. And that's what's different now. Although in many respects, this Ukraine war is shaping up like certain elements of the Second World War, there is not, certainly in the West, there is not a sense that we really know what is at stake. That may come, or it may come too late.
Well, I wonder if this then is perhaps a related point, that another parallel between what happened in the 30s and 40s and what is happening right now is the fear of contagion. Back in the 30s, there were certainly plenty in various parts of the West who would have been happy had war been confined to mainland Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, so on.
Yeah.
You fast forward to the 21st century, and it's not necessarily territorial incursions that risk this conflict broadening out, but things like, Vladimir Putin saying that, he could be supplying long-range weapons to his allies because NATO countries are now allowing their long-range weapons to be used by Ukraine against Russian territory. I think in a number of minds, Western leaders' minds, a considerable fear that we are on the cusp of something bigger than what is taking place in Ukraine.
I think you're spot on, because I've always said from the very beginning, from February 22, when this began, I said this war or this conflict will get a lot more dangerous before it is either contained or resolved. And that's been the case. And there's two sorts of escalation we can imagine. There's vertical escalation, where more weapons are used and more destruction is visited on the protagonists. And there's horizontal escalation, where it spreads to more places. And so it is entirely plausible that the war may go to Moldova, it may go to Georgia, it may come into the NATO states, and that would be a pretty big step, say in the Baltic Sea. in the Mediterranean, or the danger of it, is intrinsic to the way the war is developing. And the question for us, and of course politicians always want to limit that, they're frightened of that, rightly so. But the best way to deal with escalation is to have the preparation and the forces that can prevent it. If you just keep turning away from it, then a dictator like Putin will work on that. You know, I mean, Putin, he's not much of a strategist. He's not a chess player, but he is a poker player. He's a really good poker player
With
in
a
the
good
sense
poker
that he
face as
senses
well.
the weaknesses. Yeah, he takes risks. It's a risk. He's a risk taker. And he senses the weaknesses of his opponents and he plays on those weaknesses. That's the problem for us, is that we are caught between fear of escalation and the willingness to say the way to prevent escalation is to have a sufficient deterrent, both in military terms, but also in economic and resilience terms. We don't want to fight a war, of course we don't. But the way not to fight it is to be strong enough to deter it. And when you're up against Putin, or somebody like Putin, just as with the 1930s dictators, it wasn't only Hitler, but it was, you know, the Japanese autocracy, it was Mussolini, it was the Hungarian fascists and so on. All of these sort of people, they only respected strength, they only respected deterrence, and they played on weaknesses.
When Vladimir Zelensky later meets the leaders of those countries, let's not forget that met in battle 80 years ago today in Normandy, United States, United Kingdom, France, Canada, Germany, of course, and so on.
Yeah.
When Zelensky meets them, what will he say when asked how close to defeat is Ukraine right now?
He will say that the West has a responsibility to resist this sort of dictatorship. Because if Ukraine cannot be sustained in this war, then this world of dictatorship will just spread. It won't just be Putin pushing out into Moldova and Georgia and maybe the Baltics, but dictators around the world who are watching to see what happens. They're waiting to see which way the wind blows in world politics. And if it's going to blow decisively towards Moscow and Beijing as a result of this war, they'll make their own decisions. And so, just as in 1944, a great deal is at stake in the battles to come, because it will determine whether the world thinks that we're moving into an era of dictatorship, autocracy, and gangsterism, or whether the liberal democratic West, the West that won the war in 1940, 44, 45, whether that liberal democratic West really can, as it were, stand up for itself and show that it can maintain an international system of the sort that was established after the Second World War, so that, in the optimistic views of the time, we wouldn't have to do this again.
Well, that was going to be my concluding point, Michael. Wasn't what happened in 1945 and the immediate years after, the supranational organisations that were set up, the pan-global agreements that were signed by the industrialised nations of the world, weren't we supposed to not be in this position again?
I mean, there was a sense in 1945, they said, look, we got it wrong after the First World War. We didn't establish institutions which were strong enough to stop it happening again. So this time we will. The Western world looked really very, very strong, so that by 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed. Communism was a spent force. It looked as if the democracies were triumphant, both in warfare in the 1940s and in peaceful competition from the 1940s to the 1990s. And we were all patting ourselves on the back in 1991, saying, well, we've won the 20th century. The liberal democracies are a fact of life.
The end of history and so on.
End of history. It's just a question now of managing the future to everyone's best benefit. Well, that was 30 years ago. Hasn't worked out that way. Too much chutzpah, too much arrogance. We should have been thinking about the lessons of longer history, which is that peace doesn't last for all that long. And when it does, you have to do something to defend it. You have to pay for it. You can't have a peace dividend that goes on forever. You can enjoy a peace dividend, as indeed we have. But sooner or later, it comes to an end. Sooner or later, you've got to put in some time and effort and some sacrifice to building a peace that you can sustain.
As the king himself said on the beaches of Normandy, those who serve will never be forgotten. We should perhaps think a little bit more deeply about them from time to time.
I hope so.
Professor Michael Clarke, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for your time. And for much more on D-Day, in the words of those directly involved, 3 veterans tell their story on an earlier episode of The Daily from just a couple of days ago. Simply scroll back wherever you found this one. But that is your lot for today. We'll see you again tomorrow.